Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And this episode is sort of following up on our previous episode where we talked about Robert Welch and Welch candy. And we sort of mentioned the John Birch Society and his involvement in that at the end of the episode, but we didn't dig into any detail there. So, what we wanted to do in this episode of History You Didn't Know But Should was just look a little bit at the John Birch Society itself, its founding, what it believed, what was its political influence, those type of things is what we're going to be looking at today. So, Chris, the John Birch Society, and when I was reading through and working on my notes for this, it's a very interesting society with a very interesting history in the Republican Party.
Well, and then, goes back to kind of we were talking about sugar daddies and thin mints or junior mints the other day. And basically through the leadership of Robert W. Welch, who was that candy manufacturer, things didn't quite work out. He retires and then he wants to become involved in community and politics and life. And one of the things that he is strong with is anti-communism. And his whole plan was basically to create a society that had less federal government, more state-controlled government. He wanted more responsibility at the state level, and he just wanted a better world. And he thought that if we could get rid of all of these communists that were in the United States, then basically America would be a better society. It would be a freer society. It would be a richer society, and ultimately it would all flow from a more state level instead of a national level. And so to do that, he said, you know what? We need to start a society, a group of people who come together to make America, I hate to say it, make America great again, but that's basically kind of what he was dreaming on. And so they go and have this big gathering, which was very secretive. He invites like 12 people to come together, and these 12 people gather, and he doesn't really tell them why they're meeting. They go to a hotel and they meet in one of those ballrooms, and they're there for 2 days. And the next thing you know, at the end of that um, meeting, the John Birch Society has officially come into play. And you're right, it is more of a conservative approach to politics.
Yeah, it really is. It is a conservative approach to politics. And like you said, its real sort of initial push was anti-communism, which of course the Soviet Union at the time, the USSR, and the Cold War and all this is going on. So it's certainly understandable that people who are concerned about, America, its place in the world, threats from the Soviet Union and that kind of thing, you could certainly understand why they would maybe be attracted to something like the John Birch Society. And it was named, by the way, after a guy by the name of John Birch. He was a missionary and an intelligence officer who was killed by communist troops in 1945, which was just a little over 10 years before the formation of the John Birch Society. Um, so it starts out as this sort of anti-communist movement, but it really doesn't end there. They don't just simply go after the USSR, they go after Americans who they sort of believe are somehow in bed with the communists. And some of the people they go after, Chris, really sort of confusing. One of their big targets, so to speak, was Dwight Eisenhower, the president of the United States who had been so important in World War II. So for me, it's just very interesting some of the people that go after, and it wasn't just simply him. They went after other people as well. Martin Luther King, one that I almost found a little funny was Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. They went after him with the idea that he was a communist. So it starts off as just an anti-communist movement, but it quickly evolves into being something much bigger.
Yeah, their goal was to transform society. And, it ranges from at a world level. One of the very first things that the John Birch Society seeks to do is to make this massive campaign that is called Get Us Out or Get the U.S. Out. And the reference was to get the United States out of the United Nations.
Yeah.
United Nations is a collective group of countries that come together to try to manage world affairs. And once again, kind of going along the principles and values that Welch and the Birch Society had of wanting to be more state responsibility instead of federal responsibility. They basically was like, we don't need to be a part of the United Nations because, in their view, they thought that the United Nations was trying to build a one world government, that the United Nations was going to be the government of all countries, and that did not align, well. And so they're trying to get rid of that because there were some in the United Nations who had communist beliefs. And one of the things that just riled up the John Birch Society is that they were not consulting, they were conducting an assault on Christmas. They were trying to get rid of all the religious beliefs and all of the customs. And, so they're like, no, 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 no. We can't have getting rid of Jesus. We can't have, not being able to celebrate Christmas. So that's one area. But then they go all the way down to the local level. And this is a fascinating thing for me is that they start having this get out the vote campaign where they encourage people to go join the local PTAs or PTOs. These are parent teacher organizations into the local school districts, into the local schools. And they want them to go there so that they can basically begin taking over the schools. And just going to say, I know, we had a pledge at the beginning of this podcast not to get into modern day politics with the John Birch
How long
Society,
did that last?
but
Let's see.
but you can't help it, right? Because the John Birch Society in the 1960s is arguing about books in the school library, and we are in 2025, and we have a group of people that are arguing about books in the school library. So we're seeing similarities.
But not only that, they actually argued about fluoride in water. And we have the exact same thing going on today with Robert Kennedy talking about fluoride in water. They believe that fluoride in water was ushering in socialized medicine. Again, you hear some of the same things. I guess Chris, it goes back to something that we've talked about before, and that is, does history repeat itself or does it echo itself?
Yeah, and I think in this situation, what it is doing, it's more of an echo because it's taking some of those same fundamentalist beliefs that they had, but they're kind of going in a different motive, in a different method. And one of the problems, I guess you could say this is why it doesn't repeat itself, is because there are some Republicans who look at the John Birch Society as it's growing and they become scared of it because they think that it's overreaching and that they're just goofy because some of their ideas you mentioned earlier, you go back to this whole idea of Dwight Eisenhower. I mean, when you have the John Birch Society, which is coming out and saying that the President of the United States is a dedicated, conscious agent of the communist conspiracy in the United States, well, this ignites a controversy because no matter how much you might dislike the views of the president, you still support the president. You still support the office, if you will. And so Welch and society basically says, here's and I mean it's Dwight D. Eisenhower, the guy who was responsible for D-Day. I mean, the guy who was a tremendous leader on the battlefield, who basically saved America, and you could ultimately say saved the Allies in World War II. And so, Ray, when this sensationalistic approach by Welch and the John Birch Society starts like hammering Eisenhower, there are some conservatives who basically say, you know what, we just kind of need to ignore this group because they are becoming dangerous.
Yeah, and I think the issue with Eisenhower, and we're going to see this again here in a minute, we talk about 1964. Eisenhower was not a what you would call a real conservative, was he? He was more of a moderate, we would say. And I think that struck Welch and others, part of the John Birch Society, wrong. They did view him, as you said, as a dedicated conscience agent of the Communist Party. And, they certainly thought he was, helping facilitate that change in American society. And the organization grows. I mean, it is a growing organization in the 1960s where it sort of hits its peak. I think it's around 100,000 members. Um, and there were a lot of Americans, you mentioned this just a second ago, Chris, who sort of viewed it as, well, those people over there. But despite how it was often viewed, it played a very big, one could say, outsized, influential role on the conservative movement as it developed through the 1960s and the 1970s.
And they were so conflicted on what they believed and then how they acted. For example, I'll share with you that Welch and the John Birch Society would go out and publicly say that they publicly opposed racism. They were anti-Semitism, and they had a policy of expelling individuals who held such views. Yet, the John Birch Society opposed the civil rights movement. And they claimed once again that the civil rights movement, you mentioned Martin Luther King Jr., but they basically said that the civil rights movement and the people leading it were communist also. And so you have this group who is publicly saying, "Well, we denounce racism," but yet they start supporting George Wallace, and they are finding themselves in agreement with white nationalists, and they are moving towards segregation instead of desegregation. And we know during the 1960s, the one thing that our nation was trying to do is to unite as black and white coming together instead of being separated.
So it's 1964, Chris, and the Republicans are about to have their convention. There in, I believe it was at the Cow Palace. I believe that's San Francisco, I believe, right? They're in California. When I think of a Cow Palace, I think something totally different down in Texas, but it was Cow Palace, and the Republican are going to have their convention there. And sort of, I guess, the guy going in who was the leading conservative candidate for the Republicans going into their convention was Barry Goldwater, who was a senator at the time. And he obviously was familiar with the John Birch Society. And from what I understand, he had a lot in common with them. A lot of views he agreed with them on, but at the same time, and he wanted their support, but at the same time, he didn't necessarily want some of the things they were saying, I guess, if that makes any sense. He wanted their support. He agreed with them on some stuff, but he didn't like the way Welch and some of those other folks were approaching it. But of course, he needs them if he's going to become the Republican nominee in 1964.
And Goldwater is engaged in a very serious contest with Richard Nixon. And, that's a whole nother topic when you talk about Goldwater and Nixon,
Yeah.
because we know the end of the story, if you will, as it relates to Nixon. But I think it does show how these individuals, these they would call them Birchers, that they really tried their best to steer the Republican Party in a particular way. And fortunately, it's people like William Buckley and other individuals who kind of jump in. And even though they are influential conservatives and very conservative, they begin to denounce Welch and the John Birch Society. And they say, you know what? I think it was Buckley who said this group is far removed from common sense. And so even though they might be Republicans, even though they might be conservatives, we're kind of staying away from them. And that's kind of, I think, where you get the we hear it today, the radical left or the radical right, and that's where individuals who have these strong opinions on either side of Democrat or Republican, but they're like really far out there to where some people will kind of see them as yes, they're part of us, but really we wouldn't invite them to the family reunion because we don't want anything to do with them. And so, in the 1960s, 1970s, you're right, it's kind of seeing them at their highest. But Ray, as we move away from uh, the 60s and we start going in to the 1970s, there's there's this die down of communism, if you basically will. And so with the die down of communism and more of a rise of society issues in America, John Birch Society has to move away from politics and they start moving more into those local aspects. Those local cases, those school boards, those community centered issues.
And it didn't help when you get, well, actually, this happened in the 1960s when Ronald Reagan, I believe it was 66, he's running for governor of California. He's asked about the John Birch Society. They've apparently endorsed him, and he said, and I'm quoting him, quote, "I didn't seek their support. I didn't solicit it. They have a right to endorse anyone they want. That doesn't mean I endorse them," end quote. So as you leave the 1960s, that's sort of their height, as you said, and you get into the 1980s and you've got a president in Ronald Reagan, a Republican conservative president, Ronald Reagan, who doesn't who doesn't really welcome them into the room. So they are sort of, I guess you could say, pushed to the back of the room a little bit because of Reagan's view of them.
Yeah, Reagan's view of them, and then you move into the Vietnam War, and so tension is really moving past
Yeah.
them, and especially as you get into the 1980s and the 1990s, it really starts to decline because you have the fall of the Soviet Union. You start to see the Soviet Union is no more. You begin to hear of President George H.W. Bush, who comes in and talks about this new world order during the Gulf War of 1991. And so basically, John Birch Society is losing attention. People are moving on to other things. But it is interesting that Ray, they are even still around even today. It's not like that they just died, went away, but they will continue to advocate. I remember reading something that they wanted to get rid of the federal tax. They wanted to do things of that nature, and some of that still floated today. And it once again goes to their belief of more state power instead of federal power.
Yeah. A lot of yeah, the anti federal income tax. Of course, that's not just something promoted by the John Birch Society. That's also promoted by a lot of different conservatives and a lot of people in the conservative movement. But of course, as you mentioned, it's still around today, and it's still its influence can still be felt today, even though Reagan sort of maybe pushed away from it a little bit. We've certainly seen a return of some of the core ideas of the John Birch Society in with the current administration, especially as its second sort of what you call it, its second version, which began on January 20, 2025. Where you're seeing some of the same language, especially in, we talked about fluoride and, you know, now it's back then it was communism, now it's illegal immigrants. So we're seeing some of the same thing. Um, so same language there.
I remember reading something when Donald Trump was elected for his first term that that people began to get excited, and you saw an uptick a little bit in the John Birch Society membership because they thought that for the first time, many of the core values of the JBS or the John Birch Society was now being reflected in the White House. And some people then said that Trumpism was really Bircherism, that
Right.
there's a lot of similarities. And I don't know if it's true, but there is not scholars, but there is articles and other documents online that says that Trump's father was a close friend of Robert Welch and was also given a lot of money to the John Birch Society. So who knows?
I have no idea. I've never heard that before. I think it's certainly. I think when you look at Trump through his first term and especially this term, he has certainly opened the door to groups and people that previous Republican presidents hadn't. Whether you're talking about George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, or Ronald Reagan, where he's welcomed groups in that may be more aligned with the John Birch Society than what other presidents would have been comfortable doing.
Yeah, and I do remember reading that Bob Dylan in the 1960s, everybody knows Bob Dylan, he's a classic artist. He had a song that was called Talking John Birch Paranoid Blues.
Yeah.
And basically, it was just poking fun of, the John Birch Society. And, because they were so paranoid about these communists and things like that. So he wrote a song. And it's a pretty interesting song if listeners want to go out there and look at it, Talking John Birch Paranoid Blues. But in 1963, he was going on to the Ed Sullivan Show, which was kind of like Johnny Carson, David Letterman, Jimmy Fallon, way before it was the first one. And he said, I'm going to go on the show and I'm going to perform my Talking John Birch Paranoid Blues. Well, CBS, which was the host at the Ed Sullivan show, said, no, that's too political, it's too controversial. You're not going to be able to do it because basically we're going to get sued because you're going to go talking, about that. And Bob Dylan said, I'll either sing this song or I will not come on the Ed Sullivan show. And they said, well, we really would appreciate you to not sing that song. And he said, then fine, I won't show up. So he did not appear on the Ed Sullivan show. And many people boycotted the Ed Sullivan show because they felt that they were boycotting Bob Dylan. So just a little bit of showing how it seeps its way into political culture and kind of just talks about, that even Charlie Daniels has a song talking about John Birch, and Charlie Daniels has a lot of roots here in North Carolina. So Uneasy Rider is the other song that people can listen to that talks about John Birch Society.
Yes, CBS, they're the same people who wouldn't show Elvis below the pelvis. I'm sorry.
And thank you very much.
When you said Ed Sullivan and CBS, that's all I could think about was Elvis, you know.
They wouldn't show Elvis below the pelvis.
Yeah. But I don't know, but I guarantee you the John Birch Society opposed Elvis Presley.
I guarantee
They
you they
opposed
did.
the Beatles, so I guarantee you they'll oppose Elvis Presley.
I guarantee you they did. But
Are you
you
are
know,
are you lonesome tonight is devil worship if I've ever heard it.
just don't step on their blue suede shoes by
That's right.
posing what their views were. But it does show how politics seeps into culture, and it just continues to do that. And we make fun. I remember the good old days of Saturday Night Live that would make fun of these politics and the things that were going on. And so we still find that today. And even though the John Birch Society is still in existence, it's not really as popular, but it's still as dangerous as it once was.
And some of the ideas still remain. Well, Chris, I've enjoyed this episode and the last episode on candy. Did we talk about your favorite candy in the last episode?
We did talk about candy. We talked about my favorite candy, and if you remember it, I like to talk about M&Ms with nuts. But
Oh, that
we
is,
had that long talk about caramel also. Good Snickers bars and caramel. But still a big fan of the Junior Mints.
okay. There we go. Well, that has been settled.
And appreciate the Elvis below the pelvis. I'll be thinking about that.
I don't know where that came from, but
I
it was,
don't either. And our listeners are probably wondering why.
yeah.
We went from an American Baptist missionary to Elvis Presley all in one podcast.
Yeah.
And we included some of the classics of Bob Dylan. That's pretty cool.
You never know where we're
Only
going.
here.
You never know. And in case anybody was wondering, this is never scripted. We never script.
Nope, never scripted. Because if it was scripted, then it would just be boring.
Yep. Yep. All right. We hope you'll share this podcast with your family and friends. Give us a like on Spotify and YouTube. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
Talk to you later.